Welcome back to the DealBook DC Policy Project. I'm joined now by Steve Ballmer, of course, the former CEO of Microsoft, now owns the Clippers. And for the purpose of this conversation is the founder of USA Facts, a remarkable non-for-profit that he put together a couple years ago to look at statistics, government statistics, to help us all try to better understand what's happening in our country so that when we do make policy decisions and have policy debates, we have the facts in a way that frankly have not been available or as easily accessible as they have before. It's a pleasure for me to welcome Steve to this conversation. Great to see you, Steve.
Good to see you, Andrew. Thanks very much. I appreciate the chance to be here.
So we're having a conversation over these 2 days about policy. And as I said, you can't really have a policy conversation without having a baseline for what's happening around us. And you've put together a whole new slate of numbers to help the public understand what's happened during this pandemic, during this past year. And I thought we could spend some time talking about them to better understand what's happened. And then maybe we can get into some of the policy prescriptions and ideas that are developing on top of them. I thought we could start here. About a year out, we are now about a year out from the pandemic. And I think we're all trying to figure out what we've actually learned from all of this, specifically what happened to our economy. And frankly, what I don't think we could have ever predicted would have happened a year ago had we had this conversation and tried to predict out where we would be. So I'd start with this. When you look at this first chart on our screen, what surprised you most over the last year? If we had had this conversation 12 months ago, would have you expected the economy to be where it is today?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, I did speculate. That's not a USA Facts kind of thing. We don't speculate. But I did speculate the economy was overheated. But obviously, the pandemic changed everything. We do a once-a-year reflection. We call it the State of the Union by the numbers. It goes along with this time of the year politically. But if you just pull up one of the most important top facts, GDP shrunk last year by about $800 billion. Okay? GDP has not shrunk like that, even during the Great Recession, for many, many years, 50 plus years. So it's really a big deal. For me, it is stunning that GDP shrunk by $800 billion with a $2 trillion increase in government spending. Now, I know economists will say, blah, 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 it would have been worse if we hadn't spent the $2 trillion. I get that. But if I just look at these things like a business person and I say, something fishy about spending $2 trillion and only getting $800 billion back for it, particularly if you take a look at the fact that the savings rates, for example, are up this year with all the money that got pumped into the economy through the stimulus package. This is a very weird thing for me to look at. Everybody can draw their own conclusion, but I just see 2 trillion and 800 billion and I go, whoops, weird.
Well, you're saying weird, but let's dive into that though. I think what you're saying is this is a very inefficient use of money.
I am highlighting that issue, particularly as we've got the 1.9 trillion on the table as the next stimulus package. I'm not an economist. I'm not trying to get to root cause, but yeah, I'm asking the question, and I think it's a question everybody should be asking. We are going to pump in. We've authorized 2.6 trillion through stimulus last year. We've only spent 1.6 trillion of that. We're talking about authorizing another 2 trillion. And I am certainly more than sympathetic with the fact that there are people who are struggling because they have lost their jobs. Yet, should we be putting all this money in the economy, or should we more directly be targeting the people who need that money is a question I'd ask.
Well, let's talk about some of those people, because what do the statistics say to you about who needs that money right now and how policymakers might want to get that money to individuals and to industries?
Yeah. Look, the best case, of course, for everybody is everybody keeps their job. There's no question that is ideal. It's also no question that government policy right now says you can't keep your job. There are industries that are simply locked down. We see that in the basketball world. People aren't coming to arenas for games. People are going to lose their jobs who work in the arenas. So no matter what we do, we can keep some jobs alive, but not others.
Right.
All of the stimulus, you can see it here, $573 billion that got put in to support businesses. Is that the right number or not? Well, given that you have inevitable job loss, one can certainly say, is that the right number? Or should we have pivoted more of that money into going directly to citizens? It's a big question to ask as we see this next round of stimulus. What should really be happening there? That's the best case. You keep your job. If you don't keep your job, the one-time payment versus unemployment insurance, I have no perspective on that. The unemployment insurance to me feels more directly consistent with what people are doing. And you can see here by the numbers, unemployment insurance was the second biggest thing we put money into. Aid to state and local government,
Right.
controversial topic between the D's and the R's.
Yep.
So we can get into it.
Let me ask you about a couple other industries. You're in the sports live events business, but I'm looking at transportation, which has also been hit in particularly very hard. There's spending though of $44 billion in the airline business, which is the most they've ever had. The question I'd ask you is, as a CEO, when you think about how to spend money, how to allocate resources, how to allocate capital, whether you think that this was the best way to do it, to effectively keep either certain industries alive, or not just alive, but effectively keeping their entire payroll running during these periods, or would you be of the view that you effectively either let them, frankly, struggle for some period of time, and then have the equivalent of a restart up fund when the health issues and the pandemic get better? Meaning, what's the better way to do this?
Well, I want to first just highlight there were 100,000 jobs lost out of the airline industry, which is 23% of all jobs. So despite the stimulus, we're still having to cover a lot of those people with unemployment and stimulus checks. Probably an important thing to keep in mind. The thing that's really unique about the airline business that you don't see elsewhere is it's mostly the fixed cost of those airplanes themselves, and the debt service that winds up being on those airplanes, that's not going away. And airlines are much more dramatically a fixed capital. If they don't fly, the inventory goes away,
Right.
And yet you pay for it. It's a little bit like sports arenas. I mean, that's an inventory. We don't have fans in the building. We're still maintaining the same fixed capital cost across that infrastructure. Should we be doing that, or should we let capitalism weed that out? I think in these high fixed cost businesses, my own judgment is some support is probably required, particularly since this has become such a critical infrastructure essentially for our nation.
Where do you land on the issue of minimum wage? And one of the things that your data highlights, and this is according to the BLS and your own site, 1.6 million workers, or 1.9% of all hourly paid non-self-employed workers, earned wages at or below the federal minimum wage. That was in 2019.
Yeah, I think there are two interesting things about that. 1.9 million is a big number. And yet I'll remind you that we have over 130 million people who work in this country. If you just do the math on that, it's about 1.5% of population who work for below the federal minimum wage. And so as we have the discussion about the federal minimum wage, and certainly I am empathetic to people who don't have a living wage, very empathetic to it. I think we have to sort of scratch our heads and say that's 1% of the population that we can help. There are a lot of other people who are struggling. And the question about what to do with other folks, let's say even the bottom 20% of wage earners or the bottom 40% of wage earners. So maybe a very good thing to raise that federal minimum wage. Obviously, prices are going to go up in some businesses. Prices should go up at a place like McDonald's where people are making below that amount of money. And if And some of that's also going to hit poor people who shop at those places. On balance, my personal opinion is probably that should go up. But varying circumstances around the country. The minimum wage does different things for you in the state of Mississippi than in the state of New York.
So let me ask you a statistics question, but it's also a raging debate in Washington right now, which is the CBO has an analysis that suggests if we raise the minimum wage, 1.4 million people will lose their job. If you talk about the 1.6 million we just talked about, and it becomes complicated very, very quickly. There are some folks who say they don't believe that analysis. How do you think about that?
Again, I'm not going to be a prognosticator. I'm just going to be a little old businessman looking at numbers. It is hard for me to understand how raising wages for 1.9 million people will have the dramatic effect that the CBO described. Now, I think the CBO are the best prognosticators, the best forecasters, the most objective on almost any issue. I tell you in general, you have an economist who says X, we'll find another economist who's credible who says the opposite of X. The CBO is by definition chosen by Republicans and Democrats. I have the most faith in it. And yet, just as a business person, I can't understand their analysis.
It's a fascinating issue. Let me ask you actually related to that, because you are in the business of data and stats. And I know we just talked about the CBO and they're making prognostications. But what do you think this is maybe a meta question, a broader question. What do you think of the idea that people don't believe statistics, that they don't believe numbers, that they look at a CBO prognostication, or frankly, even may look at some of these numbers and they don't believe it?
I think part of that comes because there's a distinction between two things. There's the numbers that described what happened, and there's the numbers that guess what might happen. Even for me, it's very easy not to believe the numbers that describe what might happen. It is troubling to me, very troubling, that people don't believe government numbers that described what happened. When a politician says that, I say, darn it, your job is to get those numbers right. You're making decisions on those numbers. It's like a business person saying, oh, I don't believe the financial numbers that I'm reporting to the SEC. I'm not going to make decisions on those. That is nuts. So on that side, if the country can't build faith in those numbers, I'm going to be, that's right. Like my life's mission in a sense with this project, Andrew. People have to believe in that. The actual number of people who lost their jobs, money that got pumped into the economy, you got to believe in those. And frankly, there aren't enough of those numbers that are current enough. There aren't. I mean, I'll just pick on one. We don't really know. We can't see the numbers. We've looked for them of the increase in the savings rate, really, how much of it came at various income levels and from various professions.
Right.
Government needs to know that before the next round of stimulus. Sorry, I got revved up there.
Well, so let me ask you about that. And this goes to a technology question, and maybe it's an infrastructure question. Part of what I think you're arguing for is a more precise version of stimulus, meaning let's get the money to the people who are most vulnerable, who need it. And the question is whether we have a system in this country, an infrastructure in this country that can do that. Because one of the things you hear oftentimes from both sides of the aisle, but especially those, frankly, on the left, say, look, there is no better way to do this. We have no more efficient way to get the money out. And so, yes, there'll be some people who are going to get money that don't deserve it, but that's how we're going to get the money to the most vulnerable.
Well, as to what we need to do right now, I'll be silent. The government systems today are not very good in many ways. Government is one of the most poorly automated sectors compared to what you'd see in any kind of a business. So that'd be one point I'd make. But our country, whether it's the Data Act or a bunch of other work we're trying to do as a country, needs to invest. And it's not a lot more money. It's just, we got to get our IT systems right.
So what do you think that, but Steve, what do you think that would cost? So we're looking here at we've got the screen up here. We've got the budget right on the screen. What do you think it would cost to actually get the infrastructure, the technological infrastructure to be of the 21st century, to be here with us?
With the right kind of oversight, I'm going to make up a number, just make it up for you. Let's assume it was 10 to 15 billion dollars a year. Billion. That's a big number. But $10 billion compared to spending of $6.5 trillion, I think we can add an extra 1/6 of 1% in order to better target the other 99.9%. I just think we're making bad trade-offs in terms of getting this infrastructure, and we need mandates. We need better mandates, not only from Congress, but a lot of this money, even if it's raised at the federal level, gets spent by the states. And the states, in order to get the money from the feds, they need a mandate applied to them too to get their darn act together.
Let's talk a little bit, though, about the idea of education, racial inequality, an inclusive economy. These are things that I know you spend a lot of time thinking about. And when you look at some of the data that's emerged and some of the troubling trends that have emerged, especially during the pandemic, what do you think needs to happen?
Okay, now I speak with my hat on as a concerned citizen whose philanthropy focuses in on kids in America who don't have a shot at the American dream. I look at the numbers and I conclude a few things. Number one, kids really need to get the right kind of early childhood supports through the time they enter kindergarten. If you don't enter kindergarten ready and you can't read by third grade, you'll never really come back from an upward mobility standpoint. If you're a kid who's 3 years or 4 years old and you're in a poor neighborhood, and if you're lucky, maybe you have a little childcare, maybe your mom stays home, but more likely she's working, probably a single mom in many instances, that child deserves an opportunity to be prepared through the being read to, through going to preschool. I feel passionately about this. If you look at the total amount of money the US government, the federal government spends on Head Start, it's about $10 billion. Very small compared to the overall $6 trillion that's getting spent. If you look at the equivalent that's getting spent by the states, it's less than what the federal government spends.
Okay, so let me ask you some data questions related to this in terms of how much we're spending in budget. Oftentimes people look at the education budget in the United States on a per student basis, and they say we are spending more money than most countries, and our results are not showing it, right? We're spending way more than other countries, and we're performing at much lower levels. How do you look at those numbers relative to other countries, relative to thinking about childcare issues, relative to thinking about other kinds of support mechanisms that would change this dynamic?
Yeah. As you point out, we're spending now about $700 billion a year on K through 12 education. Put the early childhood stuff that we were just talking about aside, where I think we should increase. But if you take a look at that, you're right. It's not working for us. Only about a third of kids in 8th grade are proficient in English or math. It's crazy. My own view is, and we have shrunk class sizes. We've done a lot of things without much, small improvements, but not much really in the improvements of our kids' proficiency. I think that for many kids, having, sort of a more complete package of experiences, maybe a little longer school day, maybe some other activities that are structured after school. Certainly since the time I was a kid, many of the extracurriculars after school have gone away from many schools. So the question is, are we spending too much money, or are we not deploying it with maximum efficiency? I worry about the deployment more than I worry about the dollars, just compared to other countries. That'd be number one. And number two, it's not a very, in a business sense, it's not a very elastic system because of the way the school districts work with teachers unions. There's less ability to, contract and adapt to changing needs, if you will, for our K through 12 population, particularly as if you look at the public K through 12 population now, and I won't remember this off the top of my head, that student body is getting less affluent and more people of color. And we do know that there's real discrimination in this country against people of color, and particularly systemic racism that's affected African Americans.
A lot of the issues we talk about require spending more money. I'm curious where you might take some money away, where either you think it's being spent inefficiently or should be spent differently.
Well, again, this is policy. It's not what the facts are, and everybody's entitled to their own opinions. Some people would think, maybe correctly, maybe not, that we could delay over time the age at which you are eligible, for example, for Social Security and Medicare.
Right.
With people working longer, living longer, it's a reasonable question to ask. It would work hard on the expense side. Those are the biggest expenses. Second biggest expense, in a sense, is Medicare and Medicaid. Our healthcare system costs us more per capita, and we don't get better health outcomes. So just give you one thing. Over the last, 15 years, our medical expenses per person have risen dramatically, and yet the average age at which people die, which is where you think healthcare would work, has only increased by about 6 months. That money's got to work harder. That implies government, because government spends 50% of all dollars that could spend on healthcare. If those dollars worked harder, we could have more people covered at less cost, potentially with better care. I'm not arguing for a system of any particular match with any European country, but it is worth taking a look and having government use its buying power to both reduce its expenses. The other thing, of course, you can look at is taxes. And everybody's got their own opinion on taxes. Because I've been very fortunate, I can say to you, I'd be happy personally to pay more taxes. But that's something, again, is money better spent by the government or given to individuals to spend on their own behalf? That's a philosophic argument that I am glad D's and R's. I wish they could do it in a bipartisan way, darn it, but they don't.
Let me ask you about one other slice on this slide, which is debt. There's a massive debate in this country about how much debt we should take on, whether debt matters anymore. How do you think about that?
Okay. I'm afraid I approach this as a business person, and I know when you own the whole economy, which the US government does, the world looks different. I know that. On the other hand, I can't buy the argument. I just picked up another book to read on this topic, that the notion that debt doesn't matter. I mean, Larry Summers, who I know very well, has certainly pushed some of that argument. And yet, if we think about interest rates going up, and I can argue they really have no more room to go down. So if interest rates are going to move in any direction, they go up. If they go up, the interest on the debt goes up. Something has to decrease on expenses, or taxes have to go back up, or we just have to say, hey, we'll just keep picking on more and more debt, and we'll hope for growth in the economy. Now, the growth in the economy point, I just want to underscore, growth in the economy comes from inflation. We don't want too much of that. Growth from the economy comes from productivity per person. That has been slowing. The increase in productivity per worker has been slowing, and it comes from the number of people in our country. Our births compared to deaths are going down. The only reason our population's having quite the growth that it is because of immigration. And obviously, we don't know what we want as a country on the immigration front, but one of the way you grow your way out of the deficit is by increasing your population.
Okay, final question for you. All of these slides are in dollars. As a technology guy, what do you think of Bitcoin? Are we going to be talking about all of this in a very different way in the future? I say facetiously, but these days you look at how much it's become part of the conversation, and maybe it will.
I got to tell you, I was hearing a bunch of speculation around the Clipper organization. Should we buy Bitcoin, this Bitcoin? And I'll give you a couple things. Number one, it isn't about technology. What's going to make Bitcoin go up or down? That's some financial market thing that, is a step beyond the technologists, even though technologists pontificate about it. I have a hard time investing in things where I have no idea why they go up and down in value. That's just, probably not my biggest investment because I like to understand things by the numbers. But at the same time, as we look to open a new arena for the Clippers, which we're working on for groundbreak in 2024, we're going through the process to say, hey, are we going to take Bitcoin for payment in the arena?
Is that a real conversation? You're having that conversation?
Yeah. I sat in it the other day. We were thinking, oh my God, this might be a really important thing for us. So in which case, then, of course, I become a Bitcoin investor if we take the stuff as currency in our arenas.
Steve Ballmer, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
A lot of fun. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.